Liebe Freunde von Yad Vashem, sehr geehrte Botschafterin Küchler, der Ambassador Jeremy Issacharov, sehr geehrte Frau Botschafterin Klump, sehr geehrte Botschafter Maya Klott, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, dear friends and Shalom Chaverim. Es ist mir eine große Ehre und Freude, Sie heute begrüßen zu dürfen. Heute ist die zweite Veranstaltung aus der Reihe Behind the Scenes at Yad Vashem. Ich heiße Ruth Orr und ich bin zuständig für die Arbeit von Yad Vashem in die deutschsprachigen Länder. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich aus unserem Büro hier in Berlin. Wir haben heute ein sehr spannendes Thema für Sie vorbereitet, da es momentan nach Yad Vashem zu reisen und unmöglich ist und die diversen Programmpunkte durchzuführen, haben wir uns gefragt, wie könnten wir es möglich machen, ein interaktives Programm zum Thema Yad Vashem umzusetzen? Und was könnte für unser Publikum interessant sein? Unsere Idee ist nun, Bereiche von Yad Vashem zu zeigen, die normalerweise nicht zu sehen sind, also unsichtbar. Und mit dieser neuen Veranstaltungsreihe Behind the Scenes at Yad Vashem möchten wir Ihnen Yad Vashems komplexe und spannende Aufgabengebiete näherbringen. Und niemand kann das besser erklären als die Persönlichkeiten und Experten, die die Arbeit leiten. Die Reihe ist in erster Linie für Mitglieder und Freunde von Yad Vashem. Ich freue mich aber, heute einige eingeladene Gäste dabei zu haben, die sich für Yad Vashem interessieren. Die Erinnerung der Shoah wachzuhalten, ist keine einfache Aufgabe. Und die Existenz einer Institution wie Yad Vashem ist nicht selbstverständlich. Wenn Sie noch kein Mitglied oder Unterstützer sind, überlegen Sie bitte, es zu werden. And now, dear friends, I shall switch to English. The first thing I want to say is it's great to have you with us. This is a short session and we have a lot to get through. I'd like to remind you that this session is going to be recorded. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Ambassador Küchler. As many of you already know, Ambassador Küchler is the special representative of the German Federal Foreign Office for relations with Jewish organizations, issues relating to anti-Semitism, international Sinti and Roma affairs, and Holocaust remembrance. In addition, Ambassador Küchler is currently president of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, whilst Germany holds the presidency until March next year. Ambassador Küchler is also a member of our Freundeskreis. In all these capacities, Ambassador Küchler has been an active supporter of the work of Yad Vashem and has shown a truly extraordinary level of commitment to Holocaust remembrance. Dear Michaela, I'm thrilled that you agreed to moderate this session today. And finally, I would like to thank you, Yossi, for agreeing to take us on a tour behind the scenes of your incredibly fascinating work, for which I am full of admiration. I wish you all a stimulating hour, and over to you, Michaela. Thank you.
Grüß Gott, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde von Yad Vashem, dear members of Freundeskreis Yad Vashem of Austria, Germany, and Liechtenstein, Excellencies, dear Ruth, dear guests, I am pleased and honored to introduce to you Yossi Gevir, our esteemed speaker today. Yossi was born and grew up near Philadelphia in the United States. After having graduated from Columbia University in New York, he moved to Israel, where he served 7 years in the Israeli Army's Educational Corps. It followed a period of 2 decades in which he had leadership positions in secondary extracurricular education. In 2007, he became senior assistant to the chairman of Yad Vashem, Avner Shalev. In 2016, he was appointed head of governmental and external affairs at Yad Vashem. Yossi Gevir is also a co-head of the Israeli delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Welcome, Yossi. Thank you that you are here with us. Besides being a truly engaged and highly professional colleague who is always accessible when it comes to Holocaust-related matters and counseling on these matters, Yossi is a true and dear friend for me. What I'm most impressed with you, Yossi, is the way you speak about and you act when it comes to those who are entrusted to you, when it comes to those who are entrusted to Yad Vashem, the 6 million victims of the Holocaust. It is with full respect and even tenderness that you treat these 6 million men, women, and children. That highlights their human dignity, a dignity which Nazi Germany tried to destroy, besides their pure physical existence. Fortunately, they did not. Fortunately, the Nazi Germany failed. Today, we are going to talk about the challenges and opportunities of Yad Vashem's international diplomacy. I'm going to ask Yossi 2 questions to start off the discussion. One more general and one on high-ranking political visits to Yad Vashem. And then I would open the discussion to all of you. If you want to take part in the discussion, please use the so-called virtual hand, raise your hand, and then I try to keep up, and I will give the word to you, I will give the floor to you, and then you will be able to participate in the discussion. I'm really looking forward to a lively and interesting discussion, and I would like to start with my question number 1 to Yossi. Yossi, could you let us know how you define Yad Vashem's diplomatic mission? What fields of action are you covering, and what results have you achieved? Thank you very much for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Thank you, Ruth. I'm honored to be with you. I've been looking forward to this meeting for quite some time and have consulted with colleagues as to how to present this subject, which for me is certainly significant, and I think for you as well. I also am very touched by the remarks that, the introductory remarks that Michaela devoted to me and to our work, and I can only say that we consider the high standards that are ascribed to us as a challenge and as something we try very hard to live up to at Yad Vashem. I will, of course, be relating to your question, Michaela, which is very relevant. I think I'll be doing that as part of my initial presentation. And then after that initial presentation, which will focus on those and other matters, then we'll get to a more dialogic question and answer. So I'm going to get started now. I'm asking if you can see, if at least 1 or 2 of you can nod. Okay, very good. So I'll be speaking as we move forward with this presentation. I think, just 1 moment, please. I think for all of you who have some acquaintance with Yad Vashem, you know that it's a unique institution, a world institution. and that it functions on various planes and dimensions. What I'd like to do as we proceed with this meeting today is focus on what Yad Vashem intends, tries, and we hope succeeds in being as a focal point for world civilization. Now, that's quite a ambitious standard we set for ourselves. I think there are not many institutions in the world that attempt to be that, a symbolic and meaningful focal point for world civilization. And it's not something that we reached at, a goal that we set for ourselves easily. It's something that I think developed over the years, although it's also part of our historic mission from the start. Before we talk about Yad Vashem's international, universal missions and activities, I thought it was very important to note, even though this is not the main emphasis of my discussion with you here today, but nevertheless, it's in the foundation of what we are as an international institution, to refer briefly to something that people abroad, outside of Israel, often do not know, and that is that we are a vital source of Jewish and Israeli collective identity. I think so much of our energy, our resources, our motivation, and our abilities to reach out to all of humanity come from our authentic, particular identity as a Jewish and Israeli institution. I wanted just to illustrate this briefly by focusing on one particular day, which is a special day in Israel, but is characteristic, I think, of what we are for Israelis and Jews around the world all year long, and that is Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, which comes soon after Passover each year. Yad Vashem is then, I think, in many ways, during that day, the capital, not only of Israel, but of the Jewish people. A tremendous amount of energy and emotion and thought and identification is focused on our Mount of Remembrance campus at the ceremony, which has its permanent aspects, a certain, I would say, beloved ritual, but also renews itself each year with other aspects. The following day, there are a series of ceremonies and events of content relating to research and education, with tremendous emphasis on the survivors, who are, fortunately, some of whom are still with us. And over the years, that also has developed as almost a ritual, but a beloved ritual of how the survivors and their families and their descendants participate in the events. And special attention is devoted to youth. They have their own youth-oriented activities at Yad Vashem and elsewhere around the country on Yom HaShoah. As I said, Yom HaShoah is obviously one day a year, and the tremendous focus and attention that's placed at Yad Vashem and on Yad Vashem on that day is not as intensive throughout the rest of the year. But I think on that day, we illustrate to ourselves and to Israelis and Jews around the world how central our message is. And I think we derive a lot of our energy for the rest of the world from that centrality and authentic Jewish and Israeli identity. I wanted to say that, even though from now on, in this discussion, we'll be relating to Yad Vashem's international and universal human aspects. As I think most of you know, Yad Vashem functions both in Israel and abroad on various dimensions and planes. There is, of course, our world-famous museum and other galleries and temporary exhibitions on various themes of the Holocaust. It's an institution that is known amongst certain sectors, first and foremost for its museum, although Yad Vashem is far, far more than a museum, but the museum is a very prominent and central aspect of our activity. Then, of course, we have our extensive documentation and testimonial activity that serves as the ground, the foundation for our knowledge base and our authenticity and accuracy. Then, of course, there's extensive research activity that's based on the facts that we document, on the testimonies that we've gathered, and that we continue to preserve and make accessible to the world. And now, of course, we come to education, which certainly, since Avner Shalev, who was mentioned before, became chairman of Yad Vashem in 1993, is the central focus of Yad Vashem. I think education was always something that we aspire to, but under Mr. Shalev's chairmanship, education has become not only an emblem, but it's become very much the substance of our activity. And almost everything we do is focused on education, in imparting the knowledge base and insights of the Holocaust to young people, but basically to everyone around the world. And this requires a tremendous amount of pedagogic and didactic ability. Then, of course, there are the commemorative aspects of Yad Vashem, the ceremonial aspects, which are meaningful and symbolic, but we're convinced, and we try very hard, that in our efforts around the world, these ceremonies, for all their significance, are merely keys to the heartstrings and the minds of people. And once they're focused on the importance of Holocaust memory and remembrance, then we can get into the facts and research and education that's so important. I think what we're doing now at this moment is indicative of what I've now put on the screen, and that is that so much of what we do, even before the COVID-19 crisis that we're presently in, was and is online. A tremendous amount of digitized and accessible online activity in all our fields of activity, in both in terms of education, of course, but also in terms of research and documentation goes online. All this comes together to provide an integrated vision of what meaningful and accurate Holocaust remembrance is. We do that, as I said, at home in Israel, but certainly around the world as well. And that's part of what I feel a responsibility to portray and to get across to those people I'm in touch with around the world. And that is really guiding and enriching humanity's attitudes toward the Shoah. This is not something that came automatically to Yad Vashem. When Yad Vashem was founded in 1953, primarily by Holocaust survivors and the state of Israel, it was not obvious at all that a small, at that point, institution in a small, and that was at that point a poor state that was just building itself, could have the, I would even say the audacity, the chutzpah, as it were, to say that we could guide humanity. It was not something that happened automatically. It's something that happened over years. I do want to point out that our mandate, something that which we always remember, comes from the Yad Vashem Law. And that's in all our aspects of activity. That's an official piece of Israeli legislation from 1953. I'm not going to go into all the details. It talks about how Yad Vashem is structured and what our goals are. I do want to focus in the context of our international diplomacy that we already in 1953, those survivors who were visionaries in terms of what they foresaw would be the human universal role of Holocaust remembrance, they set down for Yad Vashem a goal to speak out to the world, as you see here, number 5, to represent Israel on international projects aimed at perpetuating the memory of the victims of the Nazis. At that time, there were no international projects, and yet the survivors prophetically and in a visionary sense set out for us that goal. Now, it's not something, as I said, that happened automatically. It took time. As so many of you know, during the 1950s, the subject of Holocaust remembrance was to a certain extent not dealt with in a very intensive fashion or very conscious fashion by either some of the survivors and certainly by many of Western societies, including the state of Israel. There's what I would call a gradual rediscovery of the Shoah, starting in 1961 with the famous Eichmann trial, with the literature and thought and philosophy and popular recollection of the Holocaust that starts during the 1960s and proceeds gradually into the 1970s. It becomes part of popular culture with television series, some of which I know reached Germany as well. And as the survivors grow older and as there is more available research, testimony, and documentation, there is more of an ability to look back on the Holocaust, both in Israel, but around the world as well. We see Holocaust museums being founded in such places as in Washington. The Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial in Poland becomes a full-fledged museum in its own unique way. And there's, in the year 2000, there was a conference of international leaders for the first time dealing with Holocaust remembrance as a world universal duty and mission. And that all along, of course, Yad Vashem has existed, but in 2005, we opened our enlarged and enhanced campus with a new museum. Of course, there was a museum before, but Yad Vashem, in a very dramatic and concrete way, joins and I would say leads, takes its leadership position in what is now, certainly from the year 2000 on, a worldwide movement, a worldwide endeavor of Holocaust remembrance. Now, Yad Vashem's activity on the international level is not just declarative. And we have engaged since 1993, when Chairman Shalev took over the leadership of Yad Vashem, in very concrete, active means of reaching out to the world in order to pursue our mission, in order to fulfill our mission. Over 200 archival agreements, dozens of research agreements with academic institutions, universities, colleges around the world, obviously in Europe, but in North America and in other places in the world as well, who over time, certainly from the 1990s on, have increased their interest in Holocaust remembrance. Hundreds of book publication agreements in which books of Yad Vashem that originally appear in Hebrew are translated into other languages. All these books obviously have to be brought to the public in other countries, translated. There are matters of rights and of copyrights, etc. All these things have to be dealt with in a professional and systematic manner. I spoke about education, how central it is to Yad Vashem. Since the year 2000, over 115 educational agreements have been signed between Yad Vashem and various governments, both national, regional, state, and various educational institutions around the world. Now, these are not just declarations of intent. Each one of these agreements has concrete ramifications and results in terms of teacher training, seminars, materials, ongoing contact with the graduates of our teacher training, hosting groups, sending teachers of ours and teacher trainers of ours around the world. Again, first and foremost to Europe and North America, but to other places around the world as well. This is all a very practical matter. And if at the beginning I may have spoken, as I think was justified, in terms of our ideals and our goals, at Yad Vashem, I think we're very practical people as well. And we know that it's not enough to have lofty ideals. You have to develop the professional expertise and insight and practicality in order to implement your goals on a practical and effective level. In terms of what I do, beyond helping to facilitate what our professionals do in the areas of education and documentation, etc., I think it's important to emphasize, and this is something that, again, if you're not in Israel, you may not know, that Yad Vashem serves as a focal point for diplomats around the world. Certainly foreign diplomats who are stationed in Israel, but also ministries of foreign affairs around the world, as you might expect, certainly in Europe and in other areas where there are countries who feel an attachment historically to the events of World War II and the Holocaust. But increasingly, certainly since I've been at Yad Vashem since 2007, it's remarkable to us that countries who have no original historical tie with the events of the Holocaust. I'm talking in Africa, in Asia, in certain parts of South America. These countries have developed over time, and increasingly today, a fascination, perhaps fascination isn't the right word, an identification, a very deep moral and ethical identification with the story of the Holocaust. Now, that's a complex kind of process that they undertake, and it's something they need guidance with, and it's something we take upon ourselves to help them with. We do this, among other things, through, and since I'm now speaking to our friends in Germany, I obviously focus here visually on the German Foreign Ministry, who Michaela represents so well, and the German Embassy in Israel, with whom I and my colleagues have very intense and I think productive contact. But as I said, this relates as well to dozens, if not hundreds, of diplomats in Israel and around the world, as well as to all the Israeli diplomats in the dozens of countries in which we are represented. They derive their information, their inspiration, but also at a very practical level, their guidance from Yad Vashem as to how to portray the Holocaust in various contexts. One of them, which I've just put here on the screen, is the famous Righteous Among the Nations program, which we pursue certainly from our base in Jerusalem, but which is reflected in the activities, among others, of our Israeli diplomats around the world, who in many cases grant the official recognition to those thousands, to date 27,000 and growing, Righteous Among the Nations who have been awarded this distinction by Yad Vashem. Of course, they do much more, and I spoke before about, and I showed what happens at Yad Vashem on the Jewish and Israeli day of Yom HaShoah in the spring, but every year on January 27th, which it's in the past 13 years or so, 14 years, has become entrenched as around the world as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. On January 27th, or sometimes the day before, after, all the foreign diplomats, the leading ambassadors of countries represented in Israel, come to Yad Vashem for an event which is to a certain extent ceremonial, but we never at Yad Vashem make do only with ceremony, only with ritual. There is always an element of education, a presentation of interesting and significant research findings, and that's certainly one of the events that I look forward to each year, when I can see, as I call them, my ambassadors, who come to Yad Vashem. And they come throughout the year as well for visits. Here you see the visit of, I think he is still the premier of Nordrhein-Westphalia, Herr Laschet, I think if I'm pronouncing it right. He visited Yad Vashem recently, and here you see him having face-to-face contact, or as I should say, face-to-print contact with authentic, archival, very, very meaningful documents that are contained amongst the over 200 million documents that our archives holds. Whenever there is a visit of a dignitary to Yad Vashem, our archival experts try to find particularly relevant and meaningful documents for he or she to see that relate to the Holocaust in his or her geographical or cultural context. And that's also something that we aim to do in our international diplomacy, bring home to everyone the relevance of the Holocaust for them, certainly if they come from nations or regions in which the Holocaust occurred, but even beyond. Then, of course, there are international organizations like the United Nations. Here you can see a picture of our chairman speaking to the United Nations on International Holocaust Remembrance Day several years ago. And that basically is how we conduct on a day-to-day and a year-to-year fashion our international activity. I would now like to go over briefly to the subject of conflicts that sometimes occur, conflicts and problems and challenges that we face in our international activity. when these conflicts occur or when these problems arise, they are not trivial. People care around the world about what Yad Vashem does, what Yad Vashem says, and what is said about it. And so when politics sometimes interfere or intervene or threaten to intervene in regard to Holocaust remembrance, we're asked our opinion. Increasingly on the social media, Holocaust remembrance, sometimes unfortunately Holocaust distortion, is brought to the fore and must be related to, and people look to Yad Vashem to do that. There are problems obviously with the more conventional media and the way they relate to the Holocaust. Books, research literature. The Holocaust is, even almost 80 years after it occurred, a subject which people around the world, as I said, even in civilizations or cultures that originally were not connected to the history of World War II, take a tremendous interest in. When dignitaries visit Yad Vashem, and sometimes things are focused on something we wouldn't even consider that significant. A president writes or does not write something, and in a guest book, it's just enough to say Yad Vashem, and that makes people interested. And it's something that we are very aware of, and which requires not only diplomacy, but experience and insight. I'm now going to rapidly go through 3 examples. There are many, 3 examples in which things did not go so smoothly. And yet, even though they didn't go smoothly, I think we gained insight, and I hope that those who had contact with us in these contexts gained a further insight into what accurate and meaningful Holocaust remembrance is. The first is, the first example I'm bringing, certainly not the first challenge we faced, but the first example I'm bringing relates to the exhibit in our museum, that this very specific corner or portion of our vast museum, which relates to the involvement of the Vatican and specifically Pope Pius XII during the Holocaust. Over the years, that display was found by some in the Catholic Church to be objectionable. They felt it was excessively critical of the Pope, and we received often criticism about it, which increased gradually after the year 2000 for various reasons. Yad Vashem decided that this was not the kind of pressure we would succumb to blindly, if at all, that if any party, nation, group, or in this case, religious community feels that something that we are portraying, could be in our museum or in a book or another educational context, is not accurate or not accurate enough, yes, we listen, but there has to be dialogue, and it can't be by heavy-handed pressure. And so eventually we were fortunate in 2009 to host at Yad Vashem a dialogue with representatives of the church, but also researchers of the Vatican involvement, independent researchers from around the world who came and discussed this subject with Yad Vashem of Pius XII and the Vatican involvement in the Holocaust. And yes, at the end of this process, not only that particular meeting, but ongoing contacts that were held, we did change to a certain extent the caption of that related to that subject in our museum, and it became a bit more balanced. We say on the one hand that there is controversy and that this subject requires further inquiry, and as you know, or you may know, one of the results of this emphasis has been that recently the Vatican, at long last, after many, many years, has agreed gradually to open up the archives relating to that period and to that individual. So these things take patience, they take delicacy, and I would say some wisdom, but it's something that we saw could be dealt with if people actually conduct contact with each other. And even though originally people said, well, if you don't change and give in to the pressure regarding changing the exhibit, popes won't visit the Yad Vashem. Well, popes do visit Yad Vashem. And I think we've gained respect for the way, the even-handed, balanced way we dealt with that issue and with others. The second example I bring is there a problem? Can you hear me?
Yossi, excuse me.
Yes.
We are 25 minutes to the end of this meeting. Can you wrap it up a bit more quickly so that participants can have a chance to ask you questions?
Yes, I'll be finished in 5 minutes.
Great, thank you.
Okay, the second example relates to the controversy between the Polish and Israeli governments. Actually, not between them, but between those governments who came to a certain agreement about it. This was about 3 years ago, regarding Poland's involvement or lack of involvement in the suffering and persecution and annihilation of the Jews of Poland. When Yad Vashem scholars came to the conclusion that that intergovernmental declaration was to a great extent inaccurate and not based on facts as the full facts, our researchers, with I think a great deal of courage and of course backing from Yad Vashem's directorate, insisted on accuracy, context, proportion, and nuance in dealing with this very, very complex subject, one of perhaps the most complex regarding Holocaust research. And one of the things we insisted on, and which I think the message went out to the world, was that responsible research of the Holocaust, as of other complex historical issues, cannot be limited by legislation or by law. And this is something which our researchers have, based upon our vast knowledge and knowledge base, have been insisting upon, both in the Israeli and in the world context. We have allies in this, as Michaela knows, in IRA, in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and in the academic and research communities. But we understand that we cannot please the politicians all the time, if any of the time, and that's not what we're about. We're not elected. We don't have to please or be popular with an electorate. It's about the truth as we know it and as we remain loyal to the historical truth. The more we can, the more we discover that truth. But there's so much we already know about the Holocaust that we are able, from Yad Vashem, together with other institutions and experts, to rely on the facts in order to teach the Holocaust, even when those facts are uncomfortable for many. The final example is something I think Michaela can certainly relate to, and that is the subject of anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, post-Holocaust anti-Semitism. This is not something that Yad Vashem originally, I think, had planned to deal with. I think the founders were hopeful that anti-Semitism wouldn't be such a huge problem after the Holocaust. Sadly, we know this is not so. And so organizations like IRA, like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, have been dealing increasingly with the subject of contemporary anti-Semitism. Yad Vashem has not become an organization, and will not become an organization, that deals per se with all aspects and activities to fight contemporary anti-Semitism, but as it regards Holocaust distortion and trivialization, certainly Holocaust denial, as sadly it often does, we join the global chorus and the global struggle against contemporary anti-Semitism. We feel this is just an example how sadly the messages that we emphasize continue to be sadly very relevant around the world, in Europe and elsewhere. And of course, there's also the subject of Islamic anti-Semitism, which often uses Holocaust distortion tropes. And that's something else that we are increasingly paying attention to. In my last minute, I will relate to the fact that, of course, I'm speaking to a German audience. It's for reasons that don't have to be explained. You know that Yad Vashem and Germany have a special bond that always was and always will be. It's a bond that's reflected in our educational agreements with each of the 16 lender, our contacts, educational contacts with the KMK, the consortium of culture and education ministers in your country. It has to do with our archival contacts, as you see here, receiving the Auschwitz blueprints from Bild magazine led by Kai Dickmann, which were contributed as the most likely and the most natural and just place for them to be were the Yad Vashem archives. Of course, art exhibitions as well, Holocaust art, which has traveled to Germany and has received extensive attention, including by your leadership. The coming to Yad Vashem, visiting Yad Vashem, here you see leaders of major German organizations, both commercial and sports and cultural organizations, I think some of whom are with us in this meeting today. Financial, budgetary support by the German government for Yad Vashem. Here you see recently, during the COVID period already, the renewal of the 10-year agreement between the German Foreign Ministry and Yad Vashem, attended by your foreign minister and ours. I must, and this will basically be almost the final thing that I relate to, the extremely moving and evocative and I think historic address of your president at Yad Vashem at the January 23rd World Holocaust Forum in Yad Vashem, hosted by our president and prime minister and Yad Vashem, but with over 50 world leaders. I think one of the most memorable addresses and important addresses was by your president, something we will never forget, and which I think is a benchmark for continued Holocaust remembrance activity in Germany. And of course, the central role, the instrumental role of the Freundeskreis, who is hosting us so graciously today, for bringing all this together in the German context and in your support for Yad Vashem. We're proud of our accomplishments. I think that's something we have a right to be, but we remain always watchful and concerned together with you. And we know there's always much to do at home and of course around the world as well. And you are our partners in that. Thank you very much.
Yossi, thank you very much for a very complete, very rich, and very interesting, going deeply into the subject speech that you gave to us.
Right. Thank you very much, Michaela. Herzlichen Dank to alle Zuhörer. It was, as I had imagined it, it was a very stimulating talk. Yossi, you did a fantastic job. Thank you. Michaela, you were a brilliant moderator. We had a small technical glitch in the middle, and thank you very much for managing that so successfully. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. I want to thank my colleagues, Lena Kraus and Margaret Emmes, who are truly behind the scenes today, hiding behind their screens in the same office as me. That's right. Thank you for plugging our event next week, Michaela, with Chaim Gertner, Director of the Archives, and Kai Diekmann, our esteemed chairman. And we have a few more sessions to go, including the one that was mentioned with Iris Rosenberg. We're really looking forward to the others. Thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye. Shalom.
Bye-bye.